The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, was enacted by the Environmental Protection Agency in 1976 and was the first federal law to address hazardous waste. It regulates any company, person, or government agency that generates, transports, treats, stores, or disposes of hazardous waste. RCRA's overall goal is minimizing the amount of hazardous waste generated in the first place. The EPA has clearly stated their intent to make sure that all generators of hazardous waste look at their manufacturing processes and eliminate from the source any potential for creating hazardous waste. The less waste created in the first place, the less waste needs to be regulated. That's good for you and good for the environment. Hazardous waste is regulated from the moment of creation to the moment of disposal. Cleanup can be extremely expensive, and fines and penalties ranging into the millions of dollars can be imposed on the violating company or individual. Due to the nature and variety of missions that take place on the installation, Redstone Arsenal produces a large amount of hazardous waste and is considered a large quantity generator, or LQG. A company, organization, or individual is considered an LQG if they produce at least 1,000 kilograms of hazardous waste per month, or 1 kilogram of acutely hazardous waste per month. Hazardous waste is defined as any discarded material that is solid, liquid, semi-solid, or gaseous. Because the EPA leaves it up to the generator to determine if their waste is hazardous, it is imperative generators are painstakingly thorough when investigating their waste. Any mistakes can have serious consequences. A generator unknowingly producing hazardous waste can threaten human lives by polluting the environment, incur expensive waste cleanup costs, or be charged by the EPA as an illegal operator, which is one of the most common and costly violations that the EPA hands out. The EPA requires a 4-step process to determine if a waste is hazardous or not. The first step is to determine if the waste is excluded from any regulations. The EPA has named over 500 specific hazardous wastes, including acetone and methylene chloride. But some of the wastes that are excluded from these regulations include domestic sewage, industrial wastewater discharges, and solid waste that does not contain any hazardous waste. The next step is to check the 3 EPA hazardous waste lists to see if your particular waste is mentioned. The first list describes non-specific sources of hazardous waste, or F-listed waste. The second list includes specific sources of hazardous waste, or K-listed waste. And the third list is the commercial chemical product list, which is broken down further into 2 distinct categories: acutely hazardous waste, or P-listed waste, and toxic waste, or U-listed waste. You may check with the Alabama Department of Environmental Management for the most up-to-date list of hazardous wastes. The third step in deciding whether or not your waste is hazardous is to determine if the waste is a mixture of listed or characteristic waste with a non-hazardous waste. It is important to note that if hazardous waste is mixed with non-hazardous waste, or with materials such as rags or spill cleanup absorbents, the entire mixture is considered hazardous. So you've checked the exclusions and your waste is not listed. Then you checked the EPA hazardous waste lists and your waste is not mentioned. Finally, you determined that your waste is not a mixture of 2 or more materials. If you are still unsure whether your waste is hazardous, use the 4 categories of characteristics the EPA has designated to identify waste that does not fit neatly onto any list: ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, and toxicity. Liquids that have a flash point of less than 140 degrees Fahrenheit are considered ignitable. These wastes are capable of combustion under standard temperatures and pressures, and burn vigorously and violently. Also, chemicals that may cause or promote combustion by easily giving up oxygen or removing hydrogen from other materials are considered ignitable. Materials that corrode steel at a rate greater than 1/4 inch per year are recognized as corrosive. Also, aqueous materials that have a pH value less than or equal to 2, or greater than or equal to 12.5, are considered corrosive. Wastes are acknowledged as reactive if they are unstable, can explode or readily undergo violent changes, are capable of generating toxic vapors, gases, or fumes, or react violently when exposed to water. The final characteristic of hazardous waste is toxicity, which includes materials that contain certain concentrations of specific industrial chemicals, metals, or pesticides. These toxic chemicals can bioaccumulate in plants, fish, animals, and humans, or can leach into soil and groundwater. According to RCRA, there are 3 ways to determine if your waste includes any of these characteristics. First, a representative sample of the waste can be tested. Second, you can draw your own conclusions based on your knowledge of the raw materials you use and on how the manufacturing processes you used may have altered them. Third, material safety data sheets provide valuable information about the hazardous characteristics of the chemicals you use. Don't risk improperly qualifying your waste. Only material identified as a hazardous waste that meets the definition of battery, mercury-containing equipment, lamps, or pesticide in 40 CFR Part 273 can be managed under the Universal Waste Regulations. Each of these universal wastes must be stored in structurally sound containers, adequate to prevent breakage. They must be stored in a way that is compatible with the contents, and the container must be kept closed unless adding or removing waste. Each container must be labeled as universal waste, along with a specific type of waste. Universal wastes may accumulate up to 1 year from the date the waste is generated, so all containers of universal waste must be marked with an accumulation start date. In the case of a release, immediately contain all releases and other residue from universal waste and determine if any material resulting from the release is hazardous. If so, the residues must be managed as such. If there is any release beyond your control, call 911. So you have determined that you have some hazardous waste using the guidelines we've discussed, and you want to know how to get rid of it. Before a generator has its waste hauled away, it must temporarily store its accumulating waste. Fortunately, RCRA allows ample time for on-site waste accumulation without requiring a waste management permit. LQGs can store hazardous waste up to 1 year. As a storage alternative, generators can also set up satellite storage areas. These can help avoid frequent movements of small quantities of hazardous waste to the main storage area. A generator can store 55 gallons of hazardous waste at or near the point of generation. When the 55-gallon limit is reached, the accumulation start date of this satellite storage begins, and the waste must then be moved to regular storage within 3 days. Hazardous waste storage containers and storage areas must be meticulously managed. All containers must have the words hazardous waste, the name of the waste, and the accumulation start date written clearly on them. The date is not required on the container in the satellite accumulation areas until it is full. Only containers in good condition may be used, and containers must always be closed unless waste is being added or removed. It is important that only containers made of or lined with a material that is compatible with the waste be used. For example, don't mix different types of waste together in a container to save storage space. Combining potentially incompatible wastes may cause an explosion, fire, or create toxic fumes. To assist in determining what waste should never be combined, refer to the EPA's list of incompatible materials. Incompatible waste should be separated from each other by dikes, berms, or walls, and no smoking signs should be posted where ignitable or reactive wastes are stored. Under federal law, a hazardous waste generator remains liable for its hazardous waste forever. Even after hazardous waste has been passed on to a transporter or a transport, storage, and disposal facility, a generator will be expected to share in cleanup costs if anything goes wrong. Generators have obligations under DOT regulations as well. A generator must provide proper packaging, marking, and labeling for the materials being shipped, placards for the carrier, and a uniform hazardous waste manifest for tracking the waste after it leaves the facility. Labels and markings provide quick identification of the materials within any container. DOT regulations call for all markings to contain the proper shipping name and the UNID number. Some materials, such as poisonous gases, require special markings in addition to those just mentioned. The container must also bear proper DOT hazard class labels and markings. The EPA requires the generator to use a special shipping document known as a hazardous waste manifest, which is a form used to track the movement of hazardous waste from the point of generation to the point of ultimate disposition. Manifesting allows the EPA to trace the mismanagement of hazardous waste to the source. It is important to follow RCRA regulations, but it is also important to ensure your health and safety by using proper personal protection equipment, or PPE, and using best management practices. Hazardous waste often comes in a liquid form and can unexpectedly splash. Protect yourself from exposure by using proper PPE, such as rubber aprons, boots, gloves, and goggles or a face shield. Vapor and particulate releases are also potential hazards when handling hazardous wastes. Be sure to transfer materials in a well-ventilated area or make use of an exhaust system. Hazardous waste can be very sensitive to any type of spark, heat, or static. When transferring waste, make sure the container is properly grounded to diffuse static electricity. Never use cell phones or other electronic devices, as they could produce a static charge and ignite flammable materials. Keep storage areas trash-free, as garbage and excess materials create more fuel in the case of a fire. Hazardous waste can also present a risk of reacting with other types of hazardous or non-hazardous waste. Chemical reactions can become explosive when incompatible substances are mixed. Be sure the waste you are transferring is segregated to the proper area. Companies must maintain their facilities in such a way that minimizes fires and other unexpected events that could release hazardous materials into the air, ground, or water. This includes maintaining equipment that may be needed in the event of an emergency. Equipment such as internal alarms or communication systems, telephones or radios, and fire extinguishers must be regularly checked and maintained. Halls and aisles must be kept free of clutter so emergency equipment and personnel can have unobstructed access in an emergency. The owners or operators of the facility must contact local police, fire, and any other agency that may be involved in an emergency at their facility in order to familiarize emergency responders with the layout of the facility, hazards, areas where people would normally be working, possible evacuation routes, and any other information that would be helpful in an emergency. Local hospitals should be contacted to inform them of types of injuries or illnesses which could result in the event of an emergency. If any potential responding agency refuses to participate, the refusal must be documented by the owner or operator of the facility. Contact your supervisor if you have any questions about the hazardous waste in your area. There must be at least one emergency coordinator available at all times. They may either be at the facility or on call, as long as they are available to respond quickly in the event of an emergency. These emergency coordinators must be thoroughly familiar with all aspects of facility activities and operations, contingency plans, location and characteristic of waste, and location of records. The emergency coordinator must also have the authority to commit resources needed to carry out the contingency plan. Whenever there is an imminent or actual emergency, the emergency coordinator should activate the emergency alarm or communication system and notify local and state response agencies. They should also identify the nature, source, and amount of released materials and assess possible hazards to human health and the environment. During the emergency coordinator must take any appropriate measures to minimize the extent of the emergency, such as shutting off processes, closing valves, collecting and containing waste, and removing and isolating containers that could be affected by the emergency. When the emergency is over, the emergency coordinator must arrange for cleanup and management of the waste, and make sure that all equipment is cleaned and maintained so it can be put back in service. After the emergency, the owner or operator of the facility must notify the proper authorities before operations resume in the affected areas, and must submit a written report with details of the incident to the regional administrator. Each LQG must have a contingency plan which includes the following: a description of the actions the facility personnel will take in the event of any unplanned release of hazardous materials, the arrangements agreed to by local police, fire, and hospitals, a list of names, addresses, home and office phone numbers of all people who are qualified to act as the emergency coordinator, a list of all available emergency equipment and where it is kept, and a complete evacuation plan. The contingency plan must be reviewed and updated immediately whenever there are changes to regulations, phone numbers, equipment, emergency coordinators, the building, process, construction, or operation that may either increase the possibility of a release or affect the response to an emergency release. LQGs are required to provide general and job-specific training to their employees. Employees must be trained how to effectively respond to emergencies, including any applicable emergency procedures, emergency response equipment, and emergency systems. Employees must also know how to implement the company contingency plan. Training must be provided by a person trained in hazardous waste management procedures and completed no later than 6 months after initial employment or assignment to a new job. Employees may not work unsupervised until the training has been completed. There are numerous training-related documents a large quantity generator must develop and maintain. See 40 CFR 265.16 for details. Compliance with RCRA means generators are required to keep numerous records. Such records confirm that the generator has correctly identified all waste generated on site. The waste has been legally transferred off-site to a permitted facility, and waste was shipped within the regulatory timeframes. Records required to be kept on file are waste analysis and test results, storage area inspection results, completed manifests, exception reports, biennial reports, and land band records. The majority of these records will have to be retained for 3 years. Good record keeping is critical. If a facility is inspected by the EPA, one of the priorities of an inspector is to examine these records. Because records are considered a good indication of the nature of a company's compliance, and because paperwork fines can quickly add up, it's important to keep records orderly, up to date, and as complete as possible. Although not required, it's a good practice for generators to keep any and all information pertaining to their hazardous waste on file. Record keeping is never easy or enjoyable, but when faced with the serious consequences of noncompliance under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, it's worth the time and effort. Keep good records. It's one of the most important steps you can take to keep your organization in good standing with the EPA. RCRA has emerged as one of the country's most tightly enforced environmental laws. With this in mind, and as the civil and criminal enforcement penalties become more severe, it's important to understand RCRA's complex regulations. Knowledge is the key to staying in compliance with RCRA regulations. Do your part to reduce and manage the amount of hazardous waste produced at your facility. Know how to identify hazardous waste and where it exists at your job site. Use only the materials necessary at your job function. Follow your site-specific responsibilities in the disposal and handling of waste that is generated. Be sure waste containers are properly marked and handled. Keep work areas clean and free of trash and debris. Wear the proper personal protection equipment and follow best safety and management practices when handling hazardous waste. The information presented here is an introduction to what is expected from hazardous waste generators. Use this information as the first step in developing and making a commitment to a comprehensive hazardous waste management program. Safe and effective hazardous waste management requires a commitment by everyone from senior executives to line workers. For more information about hazardous waste in your area, please contact the Environmental Management Office at 876-6122.